All right, well, let's get this reading quiz started. The title of the article is English Settlement and Colonization. Got a little picture there. Start right here. Have you ever moved to a new house or a new city? It can be really hard. If you move far away from the place you originally lived, you might have to make new friends and learn where everything is around town. But what if you move to a completely new continent? Beginning in the late 1500s, people from England, Spain, the Netherlands, and France moved to North America to start a new life in the colonies. The vast mountainous wilderness was very different from the cities and towns they left behind. Many of these colonists faced brutal winters with little food and unstable shelter. The colonists thought of the land as the new world, but none of the places were new to the people who were already there. For thousands of years, indigenous Americans lived on the continent, developing alliances, trade networks, and thriving communities. But when European explorers began coming to the continent in the 16th century, they brought diseases that decimated indigenous populations. Years later, when colonists arrived, some indigenous people were welcomed the new colonists, helping them plant food and trading with them. In other cases, indigenous people resisted the colonists. Over time, the relationship between the two groups deteriorated as the colonists continued to take land and resources, which threatened the indigenous way of life. The colonization and settlement of North America was difficult, but after more than a century of conflict and struggle, the 13 English colonies along the east coast of North America would eventually come together as the United States. The first English colonies. The first English attempts at colonization in North America did not last long, but in 1607, colonists established a long-term colony in Jamestown, Virginia. The Virginia Company, a trading company chartered by King James I, founded the colony. The Virginia Company hoped to find gold or profit from trade. Life in Jamestown was difficult. At first, the 104 English men and boys who established the colony spent most of their time searching for gold instead of planting crops, so food was scarce. During the first winter, most of their food came from members of the Powhatan Confederacy living nearby. As a result of their struggles, only 35 of the 104 colonists survived the first year. Their fortunes changed when John Rolfe introduced tobacco cultivation to the colony. Tobacco, which was extremely popular in Europe, proved to be a great cash crop for the colony. But colonists faced a problem. Farming tobacco was hard and labor intensive. In the decade following the founding of Jamestown, indentured servants filled the demand for cheap labor in English colonies. Servants usually worked for 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage from Europe and food and lodging in the colony. In 1619, the course of history changed when a British privateer traded, kidnapped, and enslaved Africans to Jamestown settlers. From this point on, English colonists in North America participated in the Atlantic slave trade. They brought enslaved African people to work in the tobacco fields so they could grow more crops for less money. Slave traders ripped African people from their families, friends, and communities and forced them on crowded ships to make the terrible journey to America. On the ships, many enslaved Africans died from starvation and disease. And once these ships landed on the continent, slave traders sold the kidnapped Africans to colonists who forced them to perform hard labor with no possibility of freedom for themselves or for their families. Enslaved people resisted slavery in a variety of ways. For example, enslaved people sabotaged work tools or products in order to slow down their work, self-emancipated, and organized large-scale rebellions. Over the next 100 years, more English settlers established colonies until there were 13 in total. The once poor colonies developed into a thriving source of raw materials and trade goods for England. So how did the English colonies go from struggling economically to being a successful source of revenue in less than 100 years? Let's find out. The New England colonies. The northernmost British colonies were called the New England colonies. They included Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. While the men of Jamestown came in search of riches, the first settlers in New England came for a different reason. They were pilgrims, and they came to North America in 1620 to escape religious persecution. Early European explorers had brought diseases that significantly reduced the population of local indigenous groups like the Wampanoag. However, the Wampanoag still helped the Pilgrims through a bleak first winter in exchange for an alliance. Although the alliance was helpful, many Pilgrims still died from disease, starvation, and cold during their first winter. In 1629, a larger group of Puritans founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And by 1640, more than 20,000 settlers lived in the area. The number of colonists grew quickly, and their settlements continued to encroach on indigenous lands. In some cases, colonists took the land by force. In other cases, they purchased the land from the indigenous people, but paid unfairly low prices. New England's rocky soil meant settlers could not grow and sell cash crops like the colonists did in Jamestown with tobacco. Instead, New England farmers grew food for themselves and sold any extra locally. To make the colonies profitable, other settlers went into different industries beyond farming. New England became a hub of shipbuilding, timber, fishing, and manufactured goods. New England had many natural harbors. This gave trading ships easy access to the Atlantic Ocean. The ships carried goods from New England and other colonies to the Caribbean and Europe. Port cities like Boston, Newport, and Salem became important centers of international trade. The Middle Colonies. The colonies in the Mid-Atlantic region were called the Middle Colonies. They were New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Like the New England colonies, abundant forests allowed settlers in the Middle Colonies to build successful lumber and shipbuilding businesses. They also had major port cities like New York and Philadelphia. But the Middle Colonies had something their northern neighbors didn't have. They had richer, less rocky soil. This allowed the Middle Colonies to become a major exporter of wheat and other grains. Because of this, the Middle Colonies became known as the breadbasket colonies. The Middle Colonies were also the most ethnically and religiously diverse British colonies in North America. Settlers came from all over Europe, including the following countries: England, Scotland, and Ireland. The Middle Colonies also instituted freedom of religion laws that made the area tolerant of many religious groups. Quakers, German Lutherans, Mennonites, and Presbyterians all lived in the region. Many of these settlers came as indentured servants. And like in other areas, colonists in the Middle Colonies used deceptive practices to take land from indigenous people. For example, the Lenape people of Pennsylvania signed a treaty in 1736 known as the Walking Purchase. In the treaty, the boundary was set as far as a man can go in 1 day and a half. But instead of walking to measure, colonial surveyors ran as fast as possible and claimed much more land than anticipated. The Lenape submitted formal complaints, but the land was never returned. The Southern Colonies. The Southern Colonies were made up of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Like the Northern and Middle Colonies, colonists established the Southern Colonies on land used by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The land in this area was fertile and rich. Since the winters were mild, the growing season was long. Southern colonists developed thriving economies based on growing cash crops like tobacco, indigo, and rice on vast plantations. This cash crop model with large plantations meant a few wealthy people owned a lot of the land, and all of these crops required a lot of labor to plant, harvest, and pack. Forced labor in the colonies. Many English colonists began to rely on forced labor almost as soon as they arrived in North America. At first, colonists relied on indentured servants from Europe and enslaved indigenous peoples. But in the decades following 1619, when colonists first brought enslaved Africans to Virginia, all 13 British colonies either directly or indirectly relied on the labor of enslaved African people. Slavery grew quickly in the southern colonies because owners of large plantations could make more profit by not paying laborers to work their fields. They used racist ideas to justify enslaving first indigenous Americans and then Africans. By the 1720s, brutal and permanent race-based slavery had become the primary labor system in the southern colonies. Plantation owners forced enslaved people to work long hours, tending cash crops and doing household work like cooking meals, cleaning, and taking care of children. Slavery developed differently in other regions in colonial North America. In New England, a variety of factors led to an economy based more on industry and less on farming. This meant New England business owners had less desire for a large workforce of enslaved people. However, slavery still existed in the region. White business owners enslaved people to work as domestic servants, artisans, craftsmen, sailors, and dock workers. In addition, ships carrying enslaved people often operated out of New England ports with captains and crews from the region. While laws varied across the colonies, enslaved people were treated as property with few or no rights in colonial North America. In most colonies, enslaved people could not choose where to work, learn to read or write, testify in court, own guns, legally marry, or go out at night. Families faced the constant threat of being sold and separated. Despite frequently being broken up by sale, enslaved families forged strong bonds. Kinship networks stretched across large regions. So if children were sold to nearby plantations, their grandparents, aunts, or other extended family would take care of them like parents. On large farms in the southern colonies, enslavers forced enslaved people to work from sunup to sundown, and the enslaved people usually lived together with an overseer. But after work, they spent time passing down African cultural traditions through religion, storytelling, music, and dancing. Population explosion. After the difficult beginnings in Jamestown and Plymouth, the population of the English colonies grew rapidly. By the mid-18th century, about 2 million English colonists and enslaved Africans lived in North America. But remember, England was not the only European power interested in colonizing North America. Spain and France wished for control of the continent as well. And as these populations grew and needed more land for growing crops and trading goods, conflicts increased among the European powers. While some colonists and indigenous groups developed mutually beneficial trade partnerships, these relationships began to deteriorate as well. Colonists continued to take land and change the landscape of North America. Acre by acre, settlers used incomprehensible legal documents, unfair sales, and forced to take the land as their own. In some cases, diseases unintentionally brought over colonists decimated local populations. Many settlers saw these diseases as divinely sent to free up the land for their use. As the population of European settlers exploded on the continent, lands and resources controlled and used by indigenous groups for centuries began to disappear. Soon, all of these conflicts would lead to war. Good luck.